The wind over the plains carried the kind of cold that bites through a person's coat and straight into their bones. Dust swept across the horizon, whispering the stories of those too poor to be remembered and too proud to beg. Along a dirt road that stretched farther than hope itself, a widow walked, thin, trembling, clutching the small hands of her two children. Her dress hung loose from her frame, and the boy at her side carried nothing but a tin cup that rattled in the wind. The youngest, a little girl, asked if supper would come when the sun did. The woman couldn't answer. She just said softly, "Keep walking, darling. We'll find kindness soon." But kindness was a rare thing in those dry lands. By the fifth day, their steps faltered. The widow, her name was Evelyn May Carter, hadn't eaten in nearly a week. Her skin had taken on the pallor of candle wax, her lips cracked, and still she refused to cry. There was a strength in her quiet that even hunger couldn't steal. Then, as the sun sank low, they saw it, smoke from a chimney, curling like a promise against the purple dusk. A ranch house sat alone on a ridge, wooden fences half broken, a barn slouched with age. And somewhere beyond the door was a man who'd given up on the world long before the world gave up on him. His name was Silas McGraw, a rancher with hands rough as pine bark and eyes that carried the weight of too many winters. Folks in town said he spoke to no one, that after his wife died, he turned to the land like a penance. They called him the ghost of Dry Creek. But when Evelyn knocked, 3 faint taps against the wood, it wasn't a ghost who answered. It was a man startled by the sound of life at his door. She stood there, shoulders slumped, holding her children close. Her voice cracked like an old fence post. "We haven't eaten in 5 days, sir." Silas stared, jaw tight, breath caught between disbelief and something older. Memory, maybe. Then, without a word, he turned back into the house and came out with a loaf of bread, half stale, but enough to fill their bellies. When he handed it to her, their fingers brushed. His skin was warm, hers cold as creek stone. She tried to thank him, but he shook his head. "Don't waste breath on that," he said softly. "Eat." They did. Right there on his porch, as the sun bled out behind the mountains, Evelyn tore the bread into pieces, giving her children the largest ones. Silas stood watching, feeling something shift deep inside him, a thaw, slow and unfamiliar. That night, he offered them a place to rest. "Barn's warmer than the wind," he said. But when he saw the little girl shivering, he opened his own door instead. The next morning, the widow tried to leave before dawn. But Silas was already saddling his horse. "Where you heading?" he asked. "Anywhere but where hunger finds us," she replied. He studied her, how she stood straight though her knees shook, how pride clung to her even in ruin. Something in that sight unsettled him. "Stay," he said after a pause. "Work if you must. The ranch could use hands that don't quit easy." She hesitated, glancing toward her children. Then she nodded once. Days turned to weeks. Evelyn mended fences, milked cows, cooked stew from scraps. Her laughter, faint, hesitant, began to echo in rooms that hadn't heard a woman's voice in years. Silas, at first, kept to the fields. But each evening, he'd find himself drawn to the porch, watching the lamplight flicker through the window, where she read to her children. One night, rain fell hard, drumming on the roof like restless fingers. Evelyn stepped onto the porch, shawl around her shoulders. Silas stood beside her, silent. The scent of wet earth rose between them. "You live quiet," she said after a while. "Quiet's the only thing that don't hurt," he replied. She turned her head, eyes soft but knowing. Sometimes quiet just means lonely in disguise. The rain slowed to a hush. Silas looked at her then, the courage in her tired face, the gentleness she carried despite it all. And though neither moved, something unspoken passed between them, like the moment before dawn when the world holds its breath. By winter, gossip from town began to crawl up the ridge. They called her the widow living in sin, said she was feeding off the rancher's grief. The blacksmith's wife spat her name like poison when Evelyn came for flour. Evelyn said nothing, just walked home with her head bowed. But that night, Silas found her on the porch again, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I should leave," she whispered. "They'll never let me forget what I am." He looked at her for a long moment, his breath visible in the cold. Then he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small tin ring, the one that once belonged to his late wife. "Then let them gossip about something worth their time," he said. "Marry me, Evelyn May." Her breath caught. "Why?" "Because the world's already taken everything from both of us. It doesn't get to take what we might still build." For the first time in years, she smiled, slow, trembling, radiant. Spring came, and with it green on the hills. The widow who'd once arrived starving now rode beside Silas, her children laughing in the wagon behind them. The ranch had changed, not because the fences were mended or the barn rebuilt, but because it was alive again. Neighbors still whispered, of course. But Evelyn no longer cared. She'd learned that dignity isn't given. It's grown, one act of grace at a time. And Silas? He found peace not in solitude, but in the sound of a woman humming while bread baked in his kitchen. The scent filled every corner, warm as forgiveness. That summer, when the preacher rode up from town, he asked if Silas McGraw wanted a ceremony. Silas just nodded toward Evelyn, who was kneeling in her garden with the children, sunlight in her hair. "Already had one," he said quietly. "It started the day she knocked on my door." As dusk fell over the ranch, Evelyn watched her children chasing fireflies through the field. She felt Silas's arms settle around her shoulders, heavy and sure. The wind carried the faint sound of church bells from the valley below, like a memory of all they'd survived. And somewhere inside her heart, a voice she hadn't heard in years whispered back, "You're home now." Sometimes, grace doesn't come in grand gestures or sweet words. It comes as a crust of bread offered by tired hands. Sometimes, the person who saves you doesn't ride in shining light, but stands on a porch, quiet, weathered, and kind enough to stay. Remember this, traveler. Even in a land of dust and ruin, love still grows where hunger once lived. And the greatest riches of the frontier were never gold. They were hearts that refused to harden. Like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Myths for more tales of redemption, love, and the quiet heroes of the Wild West.